Now, I know some of you are trying to guess what tonight's message is going to be about. And I am calling, it's a new series, and I'm calling it 12 Steps. Now, don't think that we're going to start having AA meetings here. I'm not going to be running a Celebrate Recovery program. But we are going to talk about some of the truths that come out of 12-step programs. Tonight what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of give you an overview, really a history lesson. Most of you cringe at history. You didn't like it in school, and now you have to hear it at church. But I think it's real helpful to understand the state that the world was in when AA started. And I think if we understand that, when we delve into those principles that they came up with, it may be helpful to us in the future. So we're going to start with a history lesson. And the first thing I'm going to do is tell you where the world was at in 1929 to 1939, and that was the Great Depression.
That was before I was born.
And, well, but it's relevant to... It's relevant to the whole history of 12-step programs. Because if you look at history, and we can start in the Bible, when people are in great distress, they cry out to God. The children of Israel did it in Egypt. Took them a few hundred years of some slavery, but they cried out to God. They did it over and over again when they were captives under the Babylonian Empire, with Persians. They would become captives, and when they hit bottom, they would cry out to God. And that's where this country was at. We were at the bottom. There was no security. There was, it was a time of despair for our country. Well, in 1931, there was a new group emerging. So this is a few years into the Depression. They had actually started beforehand, but they were gaining momentum in 1931. And they were called the Oxford Group. And they believed that the only way to change a person's behavior was with God. And so they were a religious group. And people were finding them, again, that despair made them look at life a lot differently. And they offered some hope. They worked off of 4 absolutes, and you've got them on your sheet. The first absolute was love. And they used a couple of verses in 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, to reinforce that. They felt that, secondly, purity was very important in a Christian life. And they used Psalms 51:10, created me a clean heart, O God. Honesty was important. And Proverbs 10:9 was their verse for that. And then...
Is there somebody knocking on the door back there? Or is that when they shut the door?
I think this door is just banging.
I'm sorry.
That's
I
okay.
didn't mean that problem.
The fourth one was unselfishness. And Galatians 5:24 is the verse that they used for that. And we talked about that last week in our message. In 2001, the group was still going, but they changed their name to Initiatives of Change. And but they were the impetus behind AA. That's why I bring them up, because they were very key. On December 11th, in 1934, a gentleman named Bill Wilson found the Lord. He had reached the bottom in his life. He was a full-blown alcoholic, was losing everything in his life. And he came to the realization that a school friend that he had run into a few weeks earlier by the name of Ebby Thacker, that maybe he had something, because he was dealing with his alcoholism because of the Oxford Group. He had found Christ. He had found the Lord. And he was starting to deal with his problems through those 4 absolutes that the Oxford Group talked about. Well, just because Bill got saved didn't mean that life was any easier for him. And he was on a business trip, and he ran into a gentleman named Dr. Smith. And on this business trip, he found out that Dr. Smith was also struggling, but that he was doing a little better than Bill was because he had a little more support for his newfound faith in God. And so these men paired up, and that's how AA was born. Those two men came up with a plan. They knew they couldn't do it alone. They were going to rely on somebody who understood, and they were going to do it with God's help. So at those first meetings that they held, there was a lot of talk about God. And God was invited to those meetings, and people heard about God. In fact, in 1936, Good Housekeeping wrote an article. And this is what they said about this new group. They didn't have a name yet, but this is how they described them. Having neither membership nor dues, nor paid leaders, nor new theological creed, nor religious meetings, it was simply a fellowship of people who desired to follow a way of life, a determination, not a denomination. I love that phrase. They also went on to say that the group recommended meditation and that they adhered to Christian principles. So that was how they described them. And then they talked about the 6 tenets that they followed, and these also came out of the Oxford group. And those were a complete deflation, dependence on God, a moral inventory, confession, restitution, and then continued work with others in need. So that was the basis of those first meetings, and that's what they focused on, and that's how they built their success. Well, Carl Jung lived at this time as well, and he was a famous psychoanalyst. And a gentleman was struggling with his alcoholism, and so he goes to this guy, and he says, help me. And what I found interesting was that Carl Jung, as far as I can tell, was not a Christian. His religious thinking was individualism. But here's what he did with this gentleman. He believed that the guy's case couldn't be addressed through traditional medical means. So he sent him to the Oxford group to get his help. So this secular person whose whole idea was healing people and anti-religion is sending this alcoholic. And this was a time when psychiatrists and psychologists and philosophers were all embracing religion as being part of a cure for things. Isn't it amazing the turnaround that we saw sometime after that? And now it's coming back around that they're understanding how important our spirituality is, especially when it comes to our mental health. As AA grew, the need to write things down became more important because now they're starting to open chapters around the country. And they started out with 6 steps. And I'm going to read those steps and follow along with the 6 tenets that you have on your sheet because there's some similarities there. And this is how Bill wrote them. This is a quote from him. 1, we admitted that we were powerless over alcohol. 2, we got honest with ourselves. 3, we got honest with another person in confidence. This is where the whole sponsor thing comes from. 4, we made amends for harms done others. 5, we worked with other alcoholics without demand for prestige or money. They kept it a volunteer organization. And 6, we prayed to God to help us do these things as best we could. And Bill went on to say this was the gist of the message to incoming alcoholics up to 1939, when our present 12 steps were put to paper. So when Bill sat down to start writing this out, he realized that there were more than 6 steps, and that's how we ended up with the 12 steps that we have today. The problem was that Bill had based this on his newfound faith and knew the power that God had in his life. But by now, the group was big enough, and there were atheists and agnostics in the group. And they were terribly offended because those 12 steps had way too much mention of God in them. And so there was a lot of going back and forth and debate and everything else. And so the 12 steps, most of you are familiar with how they read today. They were a compromise. And Bill regretted that compromise. But that there was nothing he could do about it. That was the only way to keep peace and move the group forward. Now, personally, I've seen a lot of people going through recovery, and I will say that those who do it with a faith and a submission to God are the most successful. I'm not saying they never relapse or anything, but they tend to be the most successful. And people who choose to do it on their own just seem to have more problems in sticking to it in the long term. That's just my personal observation from people that I know. I know people have done it without God, but for the most part, the program is most successful with God, I believe. In 1991, so we're jumping ahead quite a few decades, Celebrate Recovery started. And that came out of Saddleback Church out in California. And what they did was they tried to put Christ back into the 12 steps. And they include a worship service with their meetings and things, and they've made it much more spiritual. Then something happened in 1996 that I found interesting. The Supreme Court made a ruling, and they said Alcoholics Anonymous was religious in nature. So even though they pulled God's name out of those 12 steps, the Supreme Court still saw God in them and claimed that the 12-step programs are religious. And quite honestly, I know people many people have told me AA is their church. That's the only spirituality they get, and they lean on that for their church. And I don't buy into it, but a lot of people do. What happened with that ruling was that programs, like we have a drug court in our county, they can no longer tell people they have to go to those meetings because they're religious. They can strongly recommend them as part of their therapy and things, but they can't mandate that they go anymore. The flip side of that is that now they have to acknowledge that Celebrate Recovery is equally good. So there's always the good and the bad with things. So over the next few weeks, we're going to tear apart each one of the 12 steps, but we're not going to look at them in the light of addiction. We're going to look at them in the light of the Bible. Because you know what? I believe that if those 12 steps have survived all these years and helped so many lives, there's got to be some good truths in them for just regular, average Christians to learn and grow from. And so we're going to talk about sin, any kind of sin. We've all got something in our lives. And we're going to talk about surrender, and we're going to talk about how important that is, and why and how. We're also going to talk about, our mouths and the things that we say sometimes. And we're going to talk about healthy relationships. That's a big problem in our world today. So those are just some of the things that we're going to talk about. The Oxford group was going strong and helped so many people in a time of despair. Alcoholics Anonymous came out of that, out of AA. If you look it up, there are like 36 12-step programs in our country today. So those principles must have something that's working, that they keep duplicating it. So I think it's going to be interesting for us to explore this together and to talk about these steps just from a Christian perspective. And it's going to be interesting too to see if we get as much out of the 12 steps as people who are desperately trying to change their lives. They don't use the name of God. We freely use the name of God. So it'll be interesting to see how we do. So I hope that you're interested in this. I hope that if you know somebody who's struggling, that you would bring them, because we're going to talk about a lot of serious, heavy-duty stuff. Please join me in prayer. Father, you have certainly blessed this world with the people that came before us. Thank you for their foresight, Lord, for their determination, for the clarity that they had to start these programs and these ministries that are still going strong today, Lord. And we just pray that you would continue to help people with your truths and with your principles, Lord. And I pray that being in a community with so many that have struggles with addictions, Lord, that you would make our community stronger, make our programs stronger. Lord, give us the people that we need to sponsor and walk alongside those that are struggling. And Lord, make us stronger and better Christians. Make us more loving children, Lord. And bless the rest of our time together now. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Lonnie, is that Teen Challenge program still even going anymore?